You have no right to be here anymore. Sarah Collins whispered those words just moments before the will reading began, her voice low, calm, and sharp enough to cut through the silence of the attorney's waiting room. Mary Thompson stood just a few feet away, holding her handbag tightly, trying to understand why a family meeting that was supposed to honor her late father-in-law felt more like a silent battlefield. The office in downtown Boston was polished and cold, filled with leather chairs and the faint smell of paper and polished wood. Mary had arrived early, as she always did, believing that showing respect meant showing up prepared and composed. But something felt different today, something she could not quite name yet. Sarah Collins stood near the glass window, perfectly composed, her expression unreadable except for a faint hint of confidence that seemed almost rehearsed. John Collins, Mary's husband, avoided eye contact, pretending to scroll through his phone even though his fingers barely moved. Mary noticed everything as she always did, but chose to remain quiet. She had learned over the years that silence often revealed more than confrontation ever could. The attorney's assistant began arranging documents on a long mahogany table, signaling that the reading would begin shortly. Mary took a slow breath, reminding herself that this moment was about closure, about family legacy, about honoring a life that had once held them all together. Yet Sarah's words kept echoing in her mind, repeating like a warning she had not been meant to hear. You have no right to be here anymore. It did not sound like a joke, nor did it sound like anger. It sounded like certainty. Mary glanced at Sarah again, noticing how effortlessly she fit into the room, as if she already belonged to everything this moment represented. The attorney finally entered, carrying a thick folder that seemed heavier than it should have been. The room shifted instantly, conversations stopped, and all attention turned toward the table. Mary sat down slowly, placing her hands in her lap, preparing herself for whatever was about to be revealed. But deep inside she already felt the first crack, forming in what she believed was still her family. Outside the glass walls of the office, the city of Boston continued its usual rhythm, cars passing and people walking without knowing that inside this room, a family structure was quietly beginning to fracture. Mary kept her gaze steady on the table, unaware that the reading about to begin would not only change ownership of assets, but would also uncover truths she had buried in silence for far too long. And as the attorney adjusted the documents in front of him, the room fell into a stillness so heavy it felt like the beginning of something none of them were ready for. The attorney opened the thick folder and adjusted his glasses as the room settled into a tense silence that felt heavier with every passing second. Mary Thompson kept her hands folded in her lap, her posture steady, though her attention was fully locked on the documents in front of him. Across the table, Sarah Collins leaned back slightly in her chair, as if she already knew what was coming, her expression calm in a way that no longer felt natural. John Collins still avoided looking at anyone directly, his focus fixed somewhere near the table edge, as though the surface itself could offer him escape. The attorney began to speak in a measured tone, outlining the formal structure of the estate as it had originally been understood, listing properties, accounts, and investments that once belonged to the late family patriarch. Mary listened carefully, recognizing familiar details about the family home in Massachusetts, the investment account she had seen years ago, and the summer property in New Hampshire that had always been a place of family gatherings. Everything sounded expected at first, almost routine, until the attorney paused longer than usual, scanning a second set of documents that appeared to have been added later. That pause changed the atmosphere in the room immediately. Sarah Collins shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers lightly tapping against the armrest, a subtle movement that Mary noticed instantly. The attorney then continued, his voice still calm but now carrying a different weight, explaining that a revised amendment had been legally filed shortly before the passing of the estate owner. Mary felt a slight tightening in her chest, not from fear, but from recognition that something had shifted in a way she had not been told about. The attorney then proceeded to read the amendment in full, and with each sentence, the structure of everything Mary thought she understood began to change. The family home, the primary financial accounts, and several long-held investments were being transferred entirely to Sarah Collins. For a moment, the words did not fully register in Mary's mind, as if her thoughts were refusing to process what she was hearing. Around the room there was a brief silence so complete it felt artificial, as though everyone had stopped breathing at the same time. Sarah Collins did not react with surprise or confusion. Instead, a faint smile appeared on her face, controlled and deliberate, as if confirming something she had already accepted long before this moment. Mary slowly turned her head toward her, studying her expression with quiet precision, searching for any sign of misunderstanding or shock, but finding none. John Collins finally looked up, his expression tense and uncertain, but still silent, offering no explanation or reaction that made sense of what was unfolding. The attorney continued speaking, now addressing procedural details, but Mary heard very little of it. Her focus narrowed to the reality that the foundation of her family's legacy had just been redirected without her knowledge. She remained still, refusing to react outwardly, though internally she was already beginning to register inconsistencies she had ignored for far too long. The way Sarah had been present in recent months, the private conversation she had avoided explaining, and the growing distance in John's behavior all began to connect in Mary's mind like fragments, forming a pattern she had not wanted to see. As the attorney reached the final lines of the amendment, the shift in control was no longer theoretical. It was official, documented, and irreversible in that moment. Sarah Collins now sat as the primary holder of what once represented the entire family estate, and the room felt as though it had quietly tilted into a new reality that no one was openly acknowledging yet. Mary remained composed, but her silence had changed. It was no longer acceptance. It was observation. And in that observation, something deeper began to form beneath her calm exterior, something that suggested this was not the end of what she would come to understand about the people sitting across from her. The attorney closed the folder slightly but did not dismiss the meeting, as if the formalities still required completion despite the emotional shift that had already taken place in the room. Mary Thompson remained seated, her posture unchanged, though her awareness had sharpened in a way that made every small movement around her feel amplified. Sarah Collins, now visibly more relaxed, adjusted her position in the chair as if she had transitioned from guest to authority without needing permission or acknowledgement from anyone present. John Collins finally shifted in his seat, clearing his throat once, but still offering no words that could explain or soften what had just been revealed. The attorney continued speaking in a neutral tone, explaining procedural steps regarding transfer of control, account access, and property management responsibilities that now legally belonged to Sarah Collins under the amended documentation. Mary listened carefully, not because she accepted the outcome, but because she was beginning to understand the structure behind it. Each detail spoken by the attorney added another layer to a situation that no longer felt like a single decision, but rather a sequence of deliberate actions taken over time without her involvement. Sarah Collins now leaned slightly forward, interjecting politely for the first time, asking a question about access timelines for financial accounts, her tone calm but precise, as though she had already reviewed these details in advance. The attorney responded with equal professionalism, confirming that full administrative access would be processed within a standard timeframe of several business days. Mary observed this exchange closely, noticing how naturally Sarah was stepping into control of conversations that once belonged to the family patriarch. There was no hesitation in Sarah's voice, no uncertainty in her expression, only a steady confidence that suggested preparation rather than surprise. John Collins remained silent, his hands now clasped together on the table, his gaze fixed downward in a way that suggested discomfort but not confrontation. Mary slowly turned her attention toward him, studying his behavior with quiet precision. She noticed how he avoided any direct acknowledgement of Sarah during the attorney's explanations, as if maintaining distance could somehow preserve neutrality. Yet neutrality no longer existed in this room. The structure of authority had already shifted, and everyone present was now responding to that shift in different ways. As the attorney moved into final procedural confirmations, Sarah Collins briefly glanced toward Mary, her expression unchanged but her attention unmistakably direct. It was not aggressive, but it carried a sense of finality, as though an unspoken boundary had been established. Mary met that gaze without reacting outwardly, maintaining the same calm expression she had held since the beginning of the meeting. Internally, however, she was no longer processing the situation as a single event. Instead, she was reconstructing a timeline of interactions, conversations, and subtle changes in behavior that now formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. The attorney concluded the formal portion of the meeting by stating that all necessary legal adjustments had been recorded and would proceed according to standard administrative procedure. There was a brief silence that followed, not of confusion, but of transition, as if the meeting had technically ended but the consequences had only just begun to take shape. Sarah Collins was the first to move, gathering her belongings with measured efficiency, signaling that she no longer viewed herself as a participant in the discussion but as the central figure of its outcome. John Collins followed more slowly, still avoiding eye contact with both women. Mary remained seated for a few seconds longer than necessary, not out of shock but out of calculation, observing how each person exited the moment differently. And in that silence, she understood something important had already begun to change long before anyone had spoken it aloud. Mary Thompson remained seated for a moment after the attorney's office began to empty, her eyes calmly tracking each movement as if she were observing a scene she needed to fully understand before responding. The sound of chairs shifting and footsteps fading into the hallway marked the end of the formal meeting, but not the end of what it had started. Sarah Collins was the first to reach the door, pausing briefly as she adjusted the strap of her handbag with quiet confidence, her posture suggesting complete ownership of the outcome that had just been established. John Collins followed a few steps behind her, slower and less certain, keeping a small distance between himself and both women as they exited the office. Mary did not immediately stand. Instead, she stayed still, allowing the room to settle into silence again, noticing how quickly authority had shifted without any visible confrontation. When she finally stood, she moved at a steady pace, gathering her belongings with careful precision, not rushing and not hesitating but observing. Outside the office, the hallway felt brighter, the contrast between the controlled environment inside and the normal movement of people outside creating a subtle disorientation. Sarah Collins was already speaking with the attorney's assistant near the reception area, her tone calm and practical as she asked about administrative procedures for account transitions and property access. There was no uncertainty in her voice, only direction, as if she had already rehearsed every question in advance. Mary watched from a short distance, noting how naturally Sarah positioned herself at the center of every interaction without needing permission or validation. John stood slightly apart, checking his phone again without focus, his body language still withdrawn, avoiding engagement with both women. As Mary stepped into the hallway fully, she adjusted her coat and paused just long enough to take in the full picture. The transition that had just occurred was not only legal, it was behavioral, and she could see that each person had already adapted in their own way. Sarah was stepping into control, John was stepping away from responsibility, and Mary was beginning to step into observation. They left the building separately, with Sarah exiting first into the afternoon light, moving toward a waiting car that had already been arranged. John followed shortly after, walking a few steps behind her, maintaining distance even as they moved in the same direction. Mary exited last, taking a slower path down the front steps of the building, pausing briefly at the bottom as she looked across the street where traffic continued as usual, unaware of what had just changed inside the office. The city felt unchanged, yet her perception of everything within it had already shifted. As she stood there, she began connecting smaller details that had once seemed insignificant. Conversations Sarah had avoided explaining, the increasing frequency of private discussions between Sarah and John, and the subtle shift in how family decisions had been discussed in recent months. None of it had seemed important at the time individually, but together it formed a pattern that now demanded attention. Mary slowly began walking toward her own car, her steps measured, her expression calm, but her thoughts increasingly structured around questions she had not allowed herself to ask before. When she reached her vehicle, she did not immediately enter. Instead, she paused for a brief moment, her hand resting lightly on the door handle, as she considered the reality that what had just happened in the attorney's office was not an ending, but a transition point. Something had been set in motion that extended beyond paperwork and legal authority, reaching into personal history and hidden connections that were not yet fully visible. And as she finally opened the car door and sat down, she understood that the silence she had maintained until now would no longer be enough to explain what she was beginning to see. Mary Thompson sat in her car for several seconds without starting the engine, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, as if she needed a moment to let reality fully settle into place before deciding what came next. The parking area outside the attorney's office in downtown Boston was still active with afternoon traffic, people moving between buildings, unaware of the quiet shift that had just taken place in her life. She watched through the windshield without focusing on anything in particular at first, but her mind was no longer in the present moment. It was moving backward, carefully reconstructing the past months with a new level of attention she had not allowed herself before. Small details began resurfacing in sequence, each one insignificant on its own but increasingly troubling when connected together. She remembered Sarah Collins frequently arriving earlier than expected to family gatherings, often engaging in private conversations with John Collins that would pause whenever Mary entered the room. At the time, she had interpreted it as casual familiarity, something she did not need to question. Now it appeared different, more intentional, as if conversations had been deliberately shaped to avoid her awareness. Mary exhaled slowly and leaned back in her seat, her expression unchanged, but her thoughts becoming more structured and deliberate. She recalled how John had become increasingly distant over the past several months, spending more time outside the home under the explanation of work obligations that were never fully detailed. She had accepted those explanations without resistance, trusting familiarity more than instinct. Now that trust felt less like stability and more like a gap in observation. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the passenger seat where her handbag rested. Inside it were personal documents, phone records she occasionally reviewed, and a small notebook where she kept household information. She did not open it yet, but the awareness of it created a sense of direction. Mary slowly reached for her phone instead and unlocked the screen without hesitation. Her movements remained calm, but her focus had sharpened significantly. She did not begin by calling anyone immediately. Instead, she reviewed recent messages and call logs, scanning patterns rather than individual conversations. She noticed repeated brief calls between John and an unfamiliar number, often occurring during late afternoon hours when she was typically occupied with errands or appointments. There were also short messages exchanged that did not contain details, only timing confirmations and brief acknowledgments. Nothing explicit stood out, but the repetition formed its own pattern. Mary closed her eyes briefly, not out of emotional reaction, but as a way of organizing information internally. When she reopened them, her expression remained steady, but her decision-making process had already shifted. This was no longer about interpreting isolated behavior. It was about confirming structure beneath behavior. She placed the phone back down and started the car without urgency, merging carefully into traffic as she left the parking area. As she drove, her attention alternated between the road ahead and the internal map she was forming. She considered whether to speak directly to John, but quickly set that thought aside. Direct confrontation without clarity would not provide answers, only reactions. Instead, she began to consider external verification, someone independent who could observe without emotional connection. The idea of a private investigator came to mind, not as an emotional response, but as a practical step in understanding what she was beginning to suspect. She remembered a recommendation from a distant acquaintance years ago, a professional who handled discreet family matters without involvement in public exposure. The memory was vague, but it gave her a direction. Mary turned into a quieter residential street near her home, slowing the vehicle as she approached familiar surroundings. The house she shared with John was only a few minutes away, but she did not feel any urgency to return immediately. Instead, she remained in the car once more after parking, allowing her thoughts to settle into a clear sequence. The situation was no longer defined by shock. It was defined by information gaps. And those gaps, she now understood, could be addressed systematically. As she finally stepped out of the car and walked toward her home, her expression remained composed, but her perspective had already shifted from acceptance to observation, and from observation toward preparation for what she would need to uncover next. Mary Thompson stood for a moment just inside the front door of her home, allowing the quiet of the house to settle around her as she slowly removed her coat and placed her keys on the small table near the entryway. The familiar surroundings once gave her a sense of stability, but today they felt different, as if the same walls were holding a version of her life that no longer matched what she now understood. She walked slowly into the living room, her eyes moving across the space with quiet attention. Nothing appeared unusual on the surface, yet she was no longer looking for what was obvious. She was looking for what had been hidden in plain sight. John Collins was not home yet, which gave her time she had not expected but immediately recognized as necessary. She sat down on the edge of the sofa, placed her phone on the table in front of her, and opened a blank note. Her movements were calm and deliberate. She began listing what she already knew, not in emotional terms but in factual structure. Repeated private interactions between Sarah Collins and John Collins. Unexplained changes in financial discussions. Sudden legal adjustments that had not been communicated to her. Each point was written without hesitation, forming a pattern that became clearer with each entry. As she reviewed her notes, she leaned back slightly and closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in distress but in concentration. When she opened them again, her focus had shifted from reflection to action. She reached for her phone and began searching through contacts she had not used in years. After a few moments of scrolling, she found a name she vaguely remembered from a past conversation at a community event in Boston, a professional mentioned in connection with discrete family investigations. The memory was not detailed, but it was specific enough to recognize relevance. Mary hesitated only briefly before initiating the call. The phone rang several times before a calm professional voice answered. She introduced herself with clarity, avoiding unnecessary explanation, and asked a straightforward question about private consultation regarding family financial and behavioral review. There was no emotional framing in her words, only precision. The response on the other end was measured and respectful, confirming availability for an initial confidential meeting. A location in downtown Boston was suggested for the following day. Mary agreed without delay and ended the call shortly after confirming the details. She placed the phone back on the table and remained seated, allowing the silence of the house to return. For the first time since the attorney's office, she felt a sense of direction that was not reactive, but structured. This was no longer about interpreting what had already happened. It was about understanding what had been occurring without her knowledge. She stood up slowly and moved toward the kitchen, preparing a glass of water, her actions steady and unhurried. As she stood by the counter, she glanced briefly toward the window where the afternoon light filtered into the room. The house still looked the same, but her perception of it had shifted. She was no longer inside a complete picture. She was inside a partial one, and the missing pieces now had a clear path toward being uncovered. When she heard the front door eventually open and John Collins enter, she did not react immediately. She remained in the kitchen, listening to the familiar sound of footsteps, understanding that the next phase of her decisions would begin not with confrontation, but with information that she had already set in motion to obtain. The sound of the front door closing behind John Collins echoed softly through the house, followed by the familiar rhythm of footsteps moving across the entryway. Mary Thompson remained in the kitchen, holding her glass of water without drinking from it, her posture steady and composed as she listened without turning around immediately. She had already shifted her mindset earlier that day, and now she was observing rather than reacting. John entered the kitchen a moment later, loosening his tie as if trying to release tension from a long day, though his expression suggested something heavier beneath the surface. He glanced at Mary briefly, then toward the counter, avoiding direct eye contact as he set his briefcase down near the dining table. There was a brief silence between them that felt longer than usual, not uncomfortable in an obvious way, but noticeably restrained, as if both were aware that the dynamic between them had subtly changed even if neither had addressed it aloud. Mary finally turned slightly, still holding her glass, and acknowledged his presence with a calm expression that revealed nothing of her internal process. John asked a simple question about her day, his tone casual but measured, and Mary responded in the same neutral manner, offering no detail beyond what was necessary. The exchange was ordinary on the surface, yet both seemed to move carefully within it, as if aware that every word carried more weight than before. John walked toward the refrigerator, opened it and paused briefly before taking out a bottle of water, his movements slower than usual. Mary observed him without making it obvious, noting the subtle hesitation in his behavior, the brief pauses between actions that suggested a level of distraction she had seen increasing over recent months. She returned her attention to her glass and took a small sip of water, maintaining the calm exterior she had chosen to hold. After a moment, John spoke again, asking if everything had gone smoothly earlier in the day, referring vaguely to the attorney meeting. Mary confirmed that it had, keeping her response brief and controlled. She did not elaborate, and he did not press further, which itself carried meaning that neither acknowledged directly. John leaned against the counter, looking down at his bottle, then briefly toward the living room, as if considering whether to continue the conversation or withdraw from it. He chose silence instead, taking a sip of water and then setting the bottle down. Mary turned slightly more toward him, not with confrontation, but with observation, noting how he avoided sustained engagement. She recalled the pattern she had written down earlier, the repeated timing inconsistencies, and the private interactions that no longer felt isolated when viewed together. None of those thoughts appeared in her expression, but they were present in her awareness as clearly as the room around her. John eventually left the kitchen, moving toward the hallway with the excuse of changing clothes, leaving Mary alone again in the space. She remained standing for a few seconds longer, then placed her glass in the sink and slowly walked toward the living room. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, and consistent with the same controlled approach she had maintained since earlier that day. She sat down once more, placing her phone beside her, and briefly reviewed the notes she had made earlier. The appointment she had arranged for the following day remained unchanged, and that alone provided a sense of structure amid uncertainty. As she sat in the quiet of the room, she understood that nothing further needed to be forced in this moment. The situation was already unfolding along a path that she had begun to define, not through confrontation, but through careful observation and preparation. The following morning arrived with a quiet gray light filtering through the curtains of Mary Thompson's bedroom, casting a soft tone over a house that felt unchanged on the surface, but entirely different in meaning. Mary had woken early without alarm, her sleep lighter than usual, as if her mind had remained partially alert through the night. She sat at the edge of the bed for a few moments, hands resting calmly in her lap, allowing the awareness of the day ahead to settle fully into place. There was no sense of urgency in her movements, only structure. She dressed in a simple, composed manner, choosing practical clothing that reflected intention rather than emotion. When she stepped into the hallway, the house was still quiet. John Collins had already left earlier that morning, leaving behind a brief note about meetings and schedules, written in his usual concise manner. Mary read it once without reaction, then placed it on the kitchen counter and prepared a cup of coffee, not for comfort but for routine stability. She sat at the kitchen table with the coffee in front of her and opened her notebook again. The pages contained the same structured notes from the previous day, but now she added a few additional observations from memory, refining details rather than expanding them emotionally. Her focus remained analytical, connecting timing patterns, behavioral inconsistencies, and communication gaps that had become more visible with distance rather than proximity. After finishing her coffee, she checked the address for the appointment she had arranged the previous day. It was located in downtown Boston, in a modest professional building that specialized in private consultations. She did not review the information repeatedly. Once confirmed, she set her phone down and prepared to leave. The drive into the city was steady and uneventful, traffic moving at a consistent pace through familiar streets. As she approached downtown, Mary's attention remained divided between navigation and internal clarity. She was not attempting to predict outcomes. She was preparing to receive information without distortion. The building she arrived at was unremarkable in appearance, blending into the surrounding office structures. She parked in a nearby garage and walked the short distance to the entrance, maintaining the same controlled pace she had held since the beginning of this process. Inside, the environment was quiet, with minimal foot traffic and a neutral reception area designed for privacy. A staff member confirmed her appointment and guided her toward a small consultation room on the second floor. Mary entered and took a seat, placing her handbag beside her chair. The room was simple, with neutral walls and a table between two chairs. Within a few minutes, the door opened and a professional investigator entered. The introduction was brief and formal, and Mary responded in the same manner, stating only what was necessary to establish purpose. She explained her concern in clear, structured terms, focusing on observed behavioral changes, financial inconsistencies, and unexplained patterns in communication. She avoided emotional framing entirely, presenting the situation as a sequence of factual observations requiring verification. The investigator listened carefully, occasionally taking notes, and asked clarifying questions about Timelines, frequency of events, and known associations. Mary answered each question with precision, referencing specific periods rather than vague estimates. As the discussion progressed, the investigator outlined possible methods of discrete verification, including financial review, communication tracking within legal boundaries, and behavioral observation in public settings. Each option was presented in practical terms, without emotional interpretation. Mary considered each point carefully before agreeing to proceed with a structured initial phase of investigation, focused on confirmation of patterns rather than immediate conclusions. When the meeting concluded, there was no dramatic exchange, only a professional agreement to begin the process. Mary left the building in the same composed manner she had entered, walking back toward her vehicle with steady steps. The city around her continued its normal rhythm, unaware of any shift occurring beneath its surface. As she sat once again in her car before starting the engine, she understood that what had begun in silence was now moving into a stage defined by evidence rather than speculation. And for the first time since the attorney's office, her direction was no longer based on interpretation alone, but on a deliberate process designed to reveal what had been hidden from her view. The late afternoon light in Boston filtered through the windshield as Mary Thompson sat in her parked car outside the consultation building, not rushing to leave and not delaying the moment either. Her hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, but her attention was not on the road. It was on the structure of what had just begun. The meeting with the investigator had ended less than 20 minutes earlier, yet the weight of it had already settled into a clear internal framework. There was no emotional confusion in her thinking, only a growing recognition that information would now begin to surface in a controlled and measurable way. She started the engine and merged into traffic, moving at a steady pace through the city streets. The environment around her remained unchanged, people walking on sidewalks, vehicles moving through intersections, storefronts reflecting the fading daylight. Yet Mary's awareness was no longer aligned with surface activity. She was operating within a different layer of observation, one focused on timing, access, and hidden interaction patterns that could now be verified rather than assumed. When she arrived home later that evening, the house was already quiet. John Collins had not returned yet, and there was no message indicating a change in schedule. Mary placed her handbag on the kitchen counter and stood still for a moment, allowing the silence to settle around her. It no longer felt passive. It felt like a waiting state before information began to arrive. She prepared a light meal without distraction, eating slowly and without interruption. After finishing, she placed the dishes in the sink and returned to the living room, where she sat in the same position she had used repeatedly over the past few days. Her notebook remained on the table beside her phone. She opened it and reviewed the structured notes once again, not adding new assumptions, only refining what had already been recorded. Each detail remained consistent, but now there was a new expectation attached to them, the expectation that external verification was already in motion. Her phone vibrated once, breaking the stillness. She looked at the screen and saw a brief message from the investigator confirming that the initial phase of review had begun. There were no conclusions, only confirmation of process initiation. Mary acknowledged the message without response, placing the phone back down. She did not feel urgency. She felt alignment between observation and action. Later that evening, John returned home at a similar time as before, entering quietly and setting his keys on the counter. Mary observed him as she had done previously, noting the same patterns of limited engagement and brief, controlled interaction. He mentioned work in passing, and she responded with minimal acknowledgement, maintaining the same neutral tone she had adopted since the changes began. There was no attempt to force conversation, no effort to redefine the distance that had naturally formed. After a short time, John moved toward the bedroom, leaving Mary alone again in the living room. She remained seated, not out of hesitation, but because she was now operating within a structured waiting phase. Information would arrive in stages, and each stage would require evaluation rather than reaction. She turned off the main light in the living room, leaving only a small lamp illuminated, and opened her notebook once more. This time she did not write new entries. She simply reviewed the existing structure, confirming internal consistency. The investigation had begun, and with it, the uncertainty that had defined the previous days was gradually being replaced by a sequence of verifiable steps. Mary closed the notebook and placed it neatly on the table. She remained seated for a few more moments in the quiet room, understanding that what came next would no longer be defined by interpretation alone, but by evidence that would either confirm or dismantle everything she had begun to suspect.